was the Brown versus the Board of Education. This could be considered a movement that started in the first half of the 20th century throughout the United States, meaning that during this time, segregation had been considered or had been established as a law. By this, many schools or public schools were commonly segregated into the basis of race. This case was taken into the Supreme Court with the Plessy versus Ferguson. However, the main cause of this conflict was due to Linda's Brown education, because although she had a sort of education, she had to walk or even travel miles by bus. So there was a school near to her house, but it was an all-white school, which didn't allow her to get her in. By this, her father, Oliver Brown, decided to take this case into the United States Supreme Court, and also was argued by Thurgood Marshall. All this case, or this Brown versus Board of Education problem, was heard for the first time at 1953. And there wasn't a concrete decision, so it was postponed until fall. And finally, it was established that the segregation laws were considered as unconstitutional because the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment was being violated. It took until 1956 to see some of the changes, although there were communities, there were areas in which they considered to close their schools to prevent those integration process or even progress. And this process took even slower in some communities or some areas. So the main changes could be seen until 1960. So nowadays, thanks to this process, to this discussion, decision, or situation, we have an equal education without discrimination or even segregation.
I'm Joanna, and I'm gonna talk about Brown versus Board of Education and segregation. We have to remember that it was the fight against racial segregation in public schools because African American people were looking for equal benefits and rights in education for students. And this started when a group of African American people were tired of not receiving the same kind of education and treatment of teachers, especially. For example, teachers were not teaching the same things that the white people, because they thought that African American people were inferior to them and not at the same level. So they were not giving them the same education and knowledge. African American people start making noise because it was supposed that during this age, that was after the Civil War, the 14th Amendment was able to everyone, so African American people and white people were having the same civil rights. So they thought that it was a violation of the protection clauses of the 14th Amendment, and this was unfair for them. They was very disgusted because this was not only happening to adolescents or teenagers, it was also happening for kids. So in schools, teachers were teaching white people to be racist with them. They were in a cycle of segregation racism because we're talking about values. They were teaching white people that this was right to treat this kind of people like this. So people start exposing the situations by pacific manifestations because they want the help, a kind of help of the government. They were not asking others to help them. They want a solution, a real solution. We can see in the images like the pacific manifestations they were doing, and also we can see that they are disgusted because we're not having the 14th Amendment clauses being applied for everyone.
The characters involved in this case were principally Oliver Brown and also his daughter Linda Brown. Oliver Brown was the person who sued the Board of Education of Topeka in 1951. This happened because his daughter was denied entrance to Topeka's all-white elementary school, and he claimed that schools for black people were not equal to the white schools. Then some of the attorneys of this case defending Oliver Brown and Linda Brown were Thurgood Marshall, known as the first African American Supreme Court Justice, and he played an important role in promoting racial equality during the civil rights movement. And he, as head of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, served as a chief attorney for the plaintiffs. Then there's Jack Greenberg, um, as the first white attorney of the NAACP. Jack Greenberg helps to argue in Brown versus Board of Education at the U.S. Supreme Court level. Then there's Robert Carter. Carter was part of the legal team that developed the NAACP's strategy for ending segregation. Then there's John Scott, Charles Scott, and Charles Bledsoe. All of them, they were Topeka's-based lawyers who initially began the Brown case on behalf of Oliver Brown and the other litigants with the company of Charles Bledsoe. They worked to recruit plaintiffs willing to stand up to the school board while also researching and recruiting expert witnesses. And finally, Earl Warren, he secured an unanimous decision in Brown versus Board of Education, outlawing segregation in public schools and striking down the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy v. Ferguson.
I'm Saul Soto and I'm going to talk about the regulator. In Brown v. Board of Education, well, first a parenthesis to explain Brown v. Board. Brown v. Board of Education is considered a milestone in American civil rights history and among the most important rulings in the history of the U.S. Supreme Court. The case and the efforts to terminate the court decision brought greater awareness to the racial inequalities that African Americans faced. The case also galvanized civil rights activists and encouraged efforts to end institutionalized racism through American society. So now, that's the end of the parenthesis. In Brown v. Board of Education, the USA Supreme Court ruled unanimously that racial segregation in public schools violated the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The 1954 decision declared that separate educational facilities for white and African American students were inherently unequal. So in this case, the regulated was the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So now, what is the 14th Amendment to the Constitution? Well, it was adopted in 1868 and it granted citizenship and equal civil and legal rights to African Americans and enslaved people who had been emancipated after the American Civil War. It included them under the umbrella phrase "all persons born or naturalized in the United States." So talking about the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, well, this so-called Reconstruction Amendment prohibits the state from depriving any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and from denying anyone within a state's jurisdiction equal protection under the law. So that's all about the regulated, and thank you for the attention.
In this case of Brown versus Board of Education, the final decision that the Supreme Court of the US made was that they found this thing of separating the people, all the children that went to school by their skin tone was something bad, or to put it in a more formal way, they found that it was something unconstitutional. So because of this, they decided to end with this whole division. And now the racial segregation was ended in all schools of the US. And the consequences well, more like results of this case were that now everyone could have the same opportunities like others, like normal, but talking like in the educational way. And with all these pictures are basically what happened next to the case, that now everyone could go to the same school, no matter which skin tone they had, if you were black or if you were white. It didn't matter now. And now everyone could go to any school that they wanted without any restriction. And well, for example, in all the pictures, we can see that all the kids are together in the same room, same classroom. They are talking, being friends, and helping each other. And now with this, we can realize that they now have an equality between them. There is no segregation, no divisions anymore. They're just kids going to school every day to learn new things.